This is Aaron Proffitt, Assistant Professor of Japanese Studies at the University at Albany. And today we're going to be covering kind of a general overview and introduction to Pure Land Buddhism. Previous lectures have covered kind of basic Buddhist ideas and teachings and concepts, a brief overview of some of the features of Mahayana Buddhism. And now today we're going to kind of zoom in and focus on Pure Land Buddhism, another important aspect of the Mahayana path. If after watching this lecture you have any questions or comments, please feel free to reach out to me at my university email address here. All right, let's get started. There we go. So let's cover a couple basic terms when we're talking about this thing, Pure Land Buddhism. Pure Land Buddhism may be understood as an aspect of Mahayana Buddhism. Today, the two basic forms of Buddhism in the world are Mahayana and Theravada. Though the early history of Buddhism was fairly complex, those are kind of the two basic spheres today. And there's actually quite a bit of overlap in some interesting ways as well. But in any case, one of the defining characteristics of Mahayana as such is an emphasis on pure lands. Pure lands may be thought of as an assumed component of Mahayana cosmology. You might even think of them as like multiverse, like a multiverse idea, like other worlds where other Buddhas are teaching. Now, in some traditions within Mahayana Buddhism, your goal is to achieve rebirth into one of these worlds and progress along the Bodhisattva path more quickly by doing so. Sometimes understood that our world is a difficult world to practice in, but some of these other worlds, such as the ones we'll be talking about today, are perhaps a bit easier, so you want to be reborn there. There are also some traditions that understand these other worlds, these other Buddhas, as aspects of your own mind and fully present right here and right now. So we'll talk about these two, at least two different perspectives on the Pure Land, as well as those perspectives wherein the kind of otherworldly Pure Land perspective and the this worldly Pure Land perspective are actually kind of fused, right? The most popular Pure Land or purified world sphere, purified Buddhist sphere, is the Pure Land of the Buddha Amitabha. Now, this Buddha Amitabha has two names, Amitabha meaning limitless light. This is a symbol for wisdom, and then Amitayus meaning limitless life. This is a symbol for compassion. And Sukhāvatī, the phrase Sukhāvatī, the name Sukhāvatī means the land of bliss or utmost happiness or something like that. Sukha, being bliss, is the opposite of dukkha, which we talked about in our first lecture, dukkha being the fundamental human problem, stress, suffering, disquiet, whatever. Sukhāvatī is the opposite of that. So Sukhāvatī is sometimes called the Pure Land, whereas, again, Mahayana cosmology assumes limitless pure lands in all directions of the multiverse, perhaps. But usually when we talk about the Pure Land, this is the Pure Land we're talking about. So there's one in particular that is very special, and we'll talk about why. The Buddha Amitabha and the Pure Land Sukhāvatī are referenced in hundreds of Mahayana sutras and tantras. Sutras are like scripture, tantras are like ritual manuals, and the Buddha Amitabha and Sukhāvatī appear across many of them. Now, this is all one way of understanding Pure Land Buddhism. Pure Land Buddhism as an aspect of the Mahayana, with one Buddha that is particularly popular and a Pure Land that is particularly popular. There's another way that this term Pure Land Buddhism is used, and that's to refer to a religious movement that took place in medieval Japan. So the phrase Pure Land Buddhism can refer to a particular movement, the so-called Pure Land movement, that really kind of came to a crescendo through the careers of monks like Honen and his many disciples, especially Shinran. Honen is often associated with the Pure Land movement, but there's some sense in which perhaps Honen did not create the Pure Land movement, but rather was responding to the popular devotion of ordinary people, finding a way to use his considerable acumen as a scholar priest at on Mount Hiei, which Mount Hiei was basically the Vatican of Japan. It was the premier institution in Japan at the time. And he had studied all the great philosophies and traditions and learned the esoteric rituals and so on, but eventually focused his attention on the Pure Land path, the path to rebirth in the Pure Land of Amitabha, Sukhāvatī. And he used his considerable acumen to explain that path to ordinary people, monks and nuns, and lay people and aristocrats, everyone, right? But as what often happens with very popular movements, government and people in high positions came to resent Honin's success, and his movement was suppressed. One of Honin's disciples that was sent into exile is known as Shinran. Now, it's interesting that during Shinran's lifetime, he was maybe not so popular, not so well known, somewhat obscure, but he ends up becoming the founder of the largest school of Japanese Buddhism. Now, when we talk about Pure Land Buddhism, because of the success of Shin Buddhism, both abroad and within Japan, when we talk about Pure Land Buddhism, either as a movement in medieval Japan or as an aspect of Mahayana Buddhism, we are often dealing with views on the Pure Land path that come from the Shin Buddhist tradition. Now, I'm going to talk a bit about Shin Buddhism at the end of our conversation today, but I also want to emphasize that the Pure Land path, again, as a broader dimension of Mahayana Buddhism, is multifaceted, is diverse, and kind of touches on many areas of interest, whether they be philosophical, devotional, or meditative and contemplative, that we can also talk about. So let's dive in. All right, so let's talk about in India. What does Pure Land Buddhism look like in India? Well, is there Pure Land Buddhism in India? Maybe, maybe not. One of the earliest datable Buddha images may actually be of the Buddha Amitabha. And we find Pure Land thought and practice, right? So again, as Mahayana Buddhism spread, in South Asia, into Central Asia, into East Asia, Mahayana texts that talk an awful lot about Pure Lands are being transmitted. Mahayana philosophical literature that assumes the existence of multiple worlds through which the Bodhisattva path may run, talk about Pure Land and theorize what the Pure Land is. So whether we're talking about Indian thinkers or Buddhists in China, Korea, Tibet, Japan, wherever, people are talking about the Pure Land, right? But it's really within medieval Japan that a Pure Land school develops, right? Perhaps we could think of Mahayana Buddhism as the Buddhism of the Pure Lands, like plural, but we could think of the Pure Land movement in Japan as the Buddhism of the Pure Land, a Buddhism that is intentionally and explicitly and selectively focused on one Buddha and one Pure Land, right? Indian Buddhist literature that then is transmitted into Tibet and China and elsewhere. Indian Mahayana Buddhist literature comes to see, I think, Sukhāvatī function as a kind of generic post-mortem destination that eventually came to be a defining characteristic of Mahayana Buddhism. So, whatever we might say about the early Indian environment from which these things we call Mahayana Sutras or Tantras took shape, Sukhāvatī was already a topic of concern, right? Such that it is, as the scholar Gregory Chopin says, a generalized goal, right? It was something that's just kind of almost assumed, right? So that's very interesting, because often when people present Pure Land, they often leave it as an afterthought. Many scholars of Buddhism, especially North American English-speaking scholars of Buddhism, tend to assume that meditation and philosophy are where real Buddhism works, or where real Buddhism happens, where the real good stuff is. Whereas if you look at, and therefore, these scholars often present Buddhism in a particular way, and then at the end they're like, oh yeah, there's also this Pure Land thing, but that's just some weird thing that happened in China. It's not so. In fact, depending on how you define Pure Land Buddhism may well be one of the largest forms of Buddhism in the world. So it's something that deserves our attention and is actually endlessly fascinating. There are so many different ways you can approach it. So let's talk about some of those ways. In addition to the Pure Land of the Buddha Amitabha, one of the other popular post-mortem destinations in the Buddhist world is the Tushta heaven of the Bodhisattva Maitreya. In traditional Buddhist cosmology, we have the cosmic mountain, Mount Sumeru, and then above that are a number of heavens. One of these heavens is the Tushta heaven. According to traditional Buddhist cosmology and thought, a Buddha appears in the world, reveals the Dharma, and those teachings last for a certain amount of time. Eventually, Buddhism will disappear, at which point a bodhisattva currently living in the Tushta heaven will come down to our world and reveal the Dharma again. The Buddha Shakyamuni told us the name of that bodhisattva. His name is Maitreya, and he's up there chilling right now, just waiting until you do a Google search for Mahayana Buddhism or the Pure Land, and you get 0 results. That's when Maitreya will come down and help us out, right? Mahayana and non-Mahayana Buddhists aspire for rebirth in Tushta heaven. And in the Mahayana context, Tushta is sometimes referred to as a Pure Land. Now, this is funny because technically Tushta is a heaven, and Pure Lands are not heavens. Heavens are still within samsara. Gods in Buddhism are just like us. They are beings that are born and that eventually die. So the Pure Land is not a heaven. A Pure Land is beyond the heavens because the heavens are still in samsara. And yet, because Maitreya is a bodhisattva of the highest level, a bodhisattva who's almost a Buddha, the heaven that he inhabits is almost a Pure Land. So that's kind of fun, yeah? So at different times, especially in East Asian history, the aspiration for rebirth in the Pure Land of Amitabha or the Pure Land of Bodhisattva Maitreya were very popular, kind of depending on changing times, yeah? One of the other important Buddhas within the Mahayana is Akshobhya. As revealed in the Akshobhya Vyuha Sutra, this Buddha Akshobhya has a Pure Land to the east of our world called Abhirati. This Pure Land is interesting because it has arhats, right? So that's non-Mahayana sages who aspire to become arhats, and men and women. Okay. Some scholars theorize that the Buddha Akshobhya may have been popular in India before the Buddha Amitabha. But I kind of wonder if perhaps having, a Buddha of the East, a Buddha of the West, that there would also have been Buddhas of the North and the South and, North, and the other directions as well. Because indeed, within Mahayana literature, we often hear references to the Pure Lands of the 10 directions, right? So perhaps, this evidence about Akshobhya Buddha may reveal that, in fact, early Buddhism had a diverse pantheon. So let's continue. One of the other important Buddhas is the medicine Buddha. The Buddha Shakyamuni, who we sometimes refer to as the historical Buddha, was said to have been like a doctor who gave remedies to whatever ails you, right? If greed or anger or whatever is your particular problem, then you get a particular teaching, right? So this idea of the Buddha as a great teacher who gives, a remedy for whatever your affliction may be, he also came to be understood as a great doctor. Well, that idea of Buddha as a doctor seems to have become a Buddha, the medicine Buddha, who cures your ailments in this life, your physical ailments, then in spiritual ailments in the next life. This Buddha is often depicted holding holding a jar of medicine, and with the medicine finger out. One of the interesting things about the Medicine Buddha Sutra is that one of the benefits of worshiping the medicine Buddha is rebirth in the Pure Land of the Buddha Amitabha. That's how popular that particular Pure Land was. But the Pure Land of Lapis Lazuli, the Pure Land of the medicine Buddha, was also a very popular post-mortem destination as well. Many of the major temples in Japan, so the head temple on Koyasan of the Shingon school, the head temple of Mount Hiei of the Tendai school, and various other major temples as well, have the medicine Buddha as their main object of devotion, to just show you the ongoing relevance of this particular Buddha and his Pure Land. You could also think of mandalas as pure lands. One time I heard a scholar refer to mandalic pure lands. I was like, yes, that's a great phrase for what we're talking about here. The word mandala, which we see depicted here, the mandala of the Buddha Amitabha, one of the forms of the Buddha Amitabha. The word mandala means circle, right? It was perhaps used in meditation. But a mandala could also be a depiction of the universe, with the Buddha kind of conceived as a cosmic lord that symbolizes the totality of all things, the interconnectedness of all things, enlightened reality, mundane reality as one and all-inclusive. Or we can have a depiction of a single Buddha like we have here, in which case the mandala, in a sense, represents their Pure Land. Yeah. But a mandala is not just an object of meditation. A mandala is also often worshipped in the same way that you would a Buddha image, or honored in the same way that you would a Buddha image. You also sometimes see altar set up in front of a mandala, just like you would in front of a Buddha image or a god or whatever. So the way people engage with mandalas, I think, is really interesting. It's almost like a mandala is like a window onto another world, in the same way that an altar is set up, right? When people talk about the Butsudan, or the altar at the temple, it's like, on one side you have ordinary reality, and on the other side, with all the bells and the chandeliers and the candles and the incense, that's the Pure Land. That's another way in which the kind of mapping of the Pure Land idea is represented in real life, right? Within a Butsudan, within the architecture of an altar, within the design of a mandala as well. I'd like to focus in, now that we've kind of sketched very broadly, here's the way some of, here are some of the diversity of the Pure Lands within Mahayana. Let's focus on the one that is arguably the most popular, and that's Sukhāvatī. We read about Sukhāvatī within the Sukhāvatī Vyuha Sutra, right? But interest and concern for the Sukhāvatī Vyuha Sutra, or interest in Sukhāvatī, seems to not stem from the sutra, but rather have been perhaps it's possible that Sukhāvatī was an object of concern before the sutra that we now know was compiled, which I think is really interesting. Right? This sutra tells us about a king who encountered a Buddha named Lokeshvara Raja, and this king then renounced his throne and became a bodhisattva named Dharmakara Bodhisattva. So here we have Dharmakara Bodhisattva kneeling before the Buddha Lokeshvara Raja. So impressed was Dharmakara by this Buddha Lokeshvara Raja that he decided he wanted to become a Buddha too, and also decided that they would make a purified world sphere where all beings could practice Buddhism and achieve awakening. So as part of this bodhisattva's training, they studied the Pure Lands of all directions. They studied the diverse array of Pure Lands that one could study and practice in, and through which the your Mahayana practice may course. This bodhisattva also made a series of vows, and these vows are structured in a really interesting way that the Bodhisattva Dharmakara says, if, when I achieve Buddhahood, the beings in my Pure Land even know the word anger, or have any physical ailments, or and so on, if that's the case, may I not become a Buddha, right? So the vows, his attainment of Buddhahood is premised on his completion of these vows, right? And we'll talk about a couple of these vows. That the Buddha then achieved enlightenment, or that this bodhisattva then achieved enlightenment as a Buddha, means that all of these vows, these 48 vows, have been achieved. Okay, the name that we know this Buddha as is Amitabha, or Amitayus. Amitayus, infinite life. Amitabha, infinite light. There are two very popular bodhisattvas that are also part of this Pure Land tradition: Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara, the Bodhisattva of compassion, known as Guanyin in Chinese, or Kannon in Japanese. Alongside Amitabha, one of the most popular beings in the Buddhist world. So let's continue. One of the most popular vows from the Buddha Amitabha is vow 18. It goes like this: if, when I attain Buddhahood, sentient beings in the lands of the 10 directions, who sincerely and joyfully entrust themselves to me, desire to be born in my land and call my name even 10 times, should not be born there, may I not attain perfect enlightenment, Excluded, however, are those who commit the 5 grievous defenses and abuse the right dharma. Okay. This last line of those who are excluded is actually not present in all versions of the sutra, which is interesting. Later tradition actually basically explains away that exclusion, meaning that any being that calls upon this Buddha or contemplates this Buddha may achieve rebirth there at the end of their life. Yeah, so I want to emphasize here this even 10 times. So even 10 times doesn't mean exactly 10 times. It means, even 10 times. Yeah. This vow gives rise to a form of practice, or seems to have in part inspired a form of practice known as Buddhanusmrti, or Buddha mindfulness. So smrti is the Sanskrit that we associate with the term sati and mindfulness, and so this is mindfulness of the Buddha. In the East Asian context especially, mindfulness of the Buddha comes to be associated with chanting the name of the Buddha. So chanting the name of the Buddha, Amitabha, becomes one of the most popular forms of practice for monks and laity alike, and possibly one of the most popular forms of Buddhist practice in the world. In Sanskrit, in the Sanskrit text, it says Namo Amitabhaya. In Chinese, Namo Omitofo. Japanese, Namo Amida Butsu. Korean, Namo Amitabol. Vietnamese, Namo Adidapat. Okay. So in the Japanese tradition, the name of the Buddha, Namo Amida Butsu, here can actually be an object of devotion in its own right. So on the one hand, kind of the literal level of the sutra, it says, say this name and get this result, right? But in some traditions, because Buddhism does this interesting things where, especially in the Mahayana, we have ultimate reality and provisional reality, and they come to be realized as one. Similarly, the name of the Buddha and the Buddha to which that name refers come to be realized as one. So that the name itself is not a label for some other thing. The name itself is the Buddha. Right. So, and then in some of the more esoteric texts that I work on, the name of the Buddha and the organs of speech that produce the sound, Namo Amida Butsu, the breath that animates speech, all come to be understood as Buddha functioning and Buddha reality functioning in the world. I think that's kind of interesting. So anyway, the name itself comes to be not just a symbol for, but the Buddha themselves present within us, right? One of the other vows, vow 19, if when I attain Buddhahood, sentient beings in the lands of the 10 directions, so that's all the worlds and all the directions, who awaken aspiration for enlightenment, do various meritorious deeds, and sincerely desire to be born in my land, should not at their death see me appear before them, surrounded by a multitude of sages, may I not attain perfect enlightenment. So this vow gives rise to depictions of what would that moment look like when at your last moments of life, you're calling Namo Amida Bu, Namo Amida Bu, Namo Amida Bu, and you have a vision on your deathbed of the Buddha Amitabha. What does that look like? So this is a modern recreation of a painting from Koya-san, where I did some of my research. So we have the 25 bodhisattvas with their mystical instruments. And if you look here to the right, front center, we have a bodhisattva holding a lotus blossom. That lotus blossom is for you to get on top of and go back to the Pure Land with the Buddha Amitabha. So these visions are described as what you might see. If you're a good Buddhist who eats their vegetables and says the name of the Buddha and makes donations to your temple, this is what you might see at the moment of death. But also, again, this moment, this encounter with the Buddha is also something that people would strive for within this lifetime. So reciting the name of the Buddha for long periods of time is something that some sutras and more ascetic paths of Mahayana promote. Say the name until you have a vision of the Buddha right here and now, because that will be proof, to inspire your faith that you will achieve rebirth in the Pure Land when you die. There are even stories of great monks who achieve rebirth in the Pure Land before they die. That's kind of interesting too. All right. So I'm going to skip that. All right. So kind of recap of this part. Amitabha is one of the most commonly mentioned Buddhas across Mahayana Sutra and Tantra literature. Sukhāvatī, the Pure Land of the Buddha Amitabha, is one of the most commonly sought after postmortem destinations. Even in texts about other Buddhas and other Pure Lands, you sometimes encounter references to the Buddha Amitabha. Pure Land thought and practices are major dimensions of all Mahayana Buddhist cultures and traditions. But it's within medieval Japan that we find a unique expression of this path as a school of Buddhism, right, unto itself.